The Cronulla Sharks Rugby League Club won its opening match of the season on the weekend, but it has a long way to go before it can claim victory over the allegations of drug cheating swirling around the team. Now, since the Australian Crime Commission and the Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority proclaimed Australia's blackest day in sport earlier this year, it's been a waiting game to see which clubs, which athletes, which sports would be targeted. But despite all the speculation and rumour, there is a process here. Evidence, charges, hearings, exactly what we've seen play out internationally. A little earlier I spoke to Paul Horvath, a sports lawyer and expert, and asked him about the high-profile overseas cases like cyclist Lance Armstrong and Olympic track star Marion Jones. What comparisons can be drawn to cases here?
Well, the big thing about Lance Armstrong was that, as he touted from the treetops, he had done 500 tests and never tested positive, never been found positive. Marion Jones, similarly, multiple Olympic gold medalist in Sydney, etc., never tested positive. Both of them were found to have doped because of what are called non-analytical findings, which is things other than laboratory analysis, which is the traditional way that people are found to have drug cheated. So that is by you provide a urine or blood test, and there's a positive test for whatever the substance is. So
Let me just stop you there. You talk about non-analytic evidence. What do you mean by that? Are we talking about hearsay, allegations, the weight of allegations against a player or a club?
Well, that's right. If you take Lance Armstrong as the extreme type case, we're led to believe that the brief of evidence against Mr Armstrong was in the order of 800 to 1,000 pages of information and testimony. Something like 7 to 10 cyclists all gave evidence against him in exchange for, we're told, 6-month suspensions rather than the standard 2 years that would apply to them.
So ASADA now is seeking broader powers, is that right? They're saying that relying on testing alone does not work. They need to be able to cast the net a lot more wide.
That's right, and so we know that off the back of the Lance Armstrong inquiry, a few major personalities within Cycling Australia, including the Vice President, had to stand down because of his involvement in matters relating to Lance Armstrong and so on. That then led to the Wood inquiry, the retired judge who inquired into cycling and came down with a number of recommendations, some of which were that increased powers were necessary on the part of ASADA to find and help prosecute people who were trying to cheat the drug system.
But let's go through the phases here, because as I understand it, there are 3 phases to this. There is the evidence gathering stage, which is stage 1, then you get to the results management stage, and then later the hearing. Are we now at the evidence gathering stage when we talk about the cases, the Cronulla case, the Essendon case and others? Are we at stage 1?
That's right. Obviously, there's speculation as to what drugs have been used. We've seen certain equine drugs being alleged over the weekend in relation to Cronulla. We don't know precisely what drugs have been taken both in that scenario and in the Essendon scenario, so at this early stage it's just too speculative to say what was taken. And we can only assume that in the normal course of drug testing that took place at the clubs over the last 18 months to 2 years, that no one tested positive because of the normal ASADA and AFL and NRL drug testing protocols. Otherwise, I suspect that these matters would have come to light a lot earlier.
Well, let's talk about stage 2 now, which is the results management stage. As I understand it, that's when ASADA prepares a brief, and that brief will then go to the anti-doping rule violation panel. And they'll be like the Director of Public Prosecutions, if you like. They'll look at all the evidence and then decide if charges should be laid or if there should be a hearing. Is that right?
Well, that's right, but in my experience, what occurs through that stage is pretty much a rubber stamp. If there is any evidence really to support a charge being laid, generally the charge is laid, and it's only at the next stage that evidence is presented in order to seek to challenge what's put forward. Now, I'll say that my experience in those types of matters has been where there generally has been positive results of doping tests. So, as you've pointed out earlier, we're in a different scenario when you're dealing with these non-analytical allegations. So people are saying, I was the club high performance manager at a particular elite sporting club, and I saw people take ABC. I was part of the administration of a program, etc. And that is some of the evidence that would or could be used in those cases.
Okay, then we get to the hearing itself. What is the burden of proof here? Is there an assumption of guilt when an allegation or a case is made against an athlete? And who carries out this hearing?
So generally, I'll give the AFL scenario with which I'm most familiar. If an AFL player was charged with an anti-doping rule violation, they would be presented before the AFL tribunal, which is specially constituted by people with medical expertise as well as legal experts, etc. So different to any other type of tribunal that's conducted by the sport. The test that is used in the tribunal for the hearing for whether or not the charge is proven is on the balance of probabilities. However, there is also what's referred to as a sliding scale, and that is the more serious the allegation, the higher the standard of proof and of evidence is required to prove the charge. And when we're talking about career-ending doping matters, I would suggest that it's moving towards the higher end of the scale of proof. So as a lot of lawyers will know, it's higher than the balance of probabilities, but lower than the beyond reasonable doubt test that is set in criminal matters.
Is there an appeal process? If you're not satisfied with the result, what are the options open to you?
The other aspect to it, Stan, is that the way the WADA compliant codes, as they're called, which apply equally in NRL, in AFL, in codes of all sports around the world. So everyone complies with the WADA code, and if you don't, funding is ceased, and all major sports in Australia have fallen into line with that code. Under the code, there is a presumption of guilt, so that if you are charged with an anti-doping rule violation, as I say, there's a presumption of guilt. That is the, and generally this applies to the positive tests. So if you have your urine or blood sample test positive to a particular substance, there is a presumption of guilt. That is, it doesn't matter how the substance got into your system, the fact that the substance is in your system makes you guilty of the offence. So then, if you can show exceptional circumstances as to why that automatic 2-year ban that applies in most cases should be reduced, there's a two-stage process for that generally. One is that you can show that there was no significant fault or negligence on your part, or the second stage, which gives you the greater reduction, is that you can show that there was no fault or no negligence on your part, which obviously is a very high test to satisfy, but that second test can get you anywhere down to a penalty of 0 months suspension.
So as you've outlined it here, are we all just getting too far ahead of ourselves? Because at the moment we hear about penalties being suggested, deals being cut, we're hearing a lot of commentary, a lot of comments from clubs and administrators and players themselves. But as you say, we are only at stage 1 here. Is there a risk of trying to presume too much too soon?
Again, I haven't looked at the rules in the NRL. My understanding with the AFL rules is that initially you go to an AFL tribunal, then a party can appeal any decision to the AFL appeals board, and from there my understanding is that an appeal can go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport.
So, Paul, can I just clarify this? What you're telling me is that it would be easier for someone to prove their innocence in a criminal case than it would be for an athlete to prove they're innocent in an anti-drugs case?
Well, yes and no. I guess you'd need to do a bit of digging into the Lance Armstrong case, and it would seem, certainly from a distance, that what USADA did was to, as they say, line all of its ducks up in a row, and they had the testimony of a number of cyclists ready to go when the allegations were put forward. So it wasn't one or two people, it was an overwhelming case that was being put together. In current allegations, as we know them, certainly, and take the NRL as an example, we're told that a person within the club has become the so-called whistleblower, or if you like, has agreed to give some testimony to USADA. That's only one piece of evidence, and as you say, well, that could be partial evidence in a case, but obviously it's a lot stronger if there is other evidence as well. So if USADA believes it has a case against one or some or a number of athletes, and it's got some support for that, then obviously its case is going to be strengthened by gaining evidence and testimony from others. And certainly my experience in a range of cases, and in particular criminal cases, the strongest cases are where a person makes the case against themselves, that is by their own admissions. Now the incentive here is that, again going back to the Lance Armstrong case, a person who is otherwise facing a 2-year penalty has the option of obtaining a reduction of up to 3/4 of the otherwise applicable penalty, so reduced down to 6 months. The difficulty, and it's a fair comment it seems from observers and certainly in the media, is that it seems that a major decision about something that will have a significant impact on a player's career, namely spending 6 months on the sideline, seems to have been put on the table in a very short period of time, and players are feeling, it would seem, under quite a bit of pressure to make game-changing decisions, so to speak. And I think that's a fair comment. The flip side of that is that if there is convincing evidence, although not overwhelming at this stage, and a player is giving themselves a chance at a reduced penalty, then it's a conundrum that they have to weigh up very carefully. And you might think they might need to go and get some independent advice from other lawyers outside the club perhaps, and so on. But at the moment, from what I'm reading in the media, the response is that no, we're going to fight these allegations all the way, and we don't think there's any wrongdoing. But I'd just say about that one of the difficulties is that the WADA code and the anti-doping programs adopted by the professional codes in the country, which in Australia, which are WADA compliant, are very, very tough. And so it is very difficult to prove that you had no fault or negligence, or no significant fault or negligence. And so on one view, the carrot of a 6-month penalty has some attraction, and you've just got to weigh up all your risks, etc. And you've got to be pretty sure that you can improve on the 6 months that's on offer if you decide to reject that proposal and fight the case all the way.
Paul Horvath, we certainly appreciate you taking us through this one stage at a time. There is certainly a lot more to go in cases that we're hearing about here. Thanks again.
It's a pleasure.